Auror alarms sounded exactly like tearing metal. Hermione Granger didn't flinch. She had 70 seconds before the ward doors blew open. She snapped on her dragonhide gloves. Green. Thick. Stain-resistant. Clear bed 4. She ordered. Healer Strout scrambled out of her way. The other junior healers moved fast. Hermione moved faster. She didn't run. She never ran. She just arrived at the center of the chaos before anyone else knew what was happening. It was a talent. It was also a necessity when you ran the curse damage ward at St. Mungo's. The double doors at the end of the corridor slammed open. Harry Potter looked terrible. His aura coat was shredded at the shoulder. His glasses were cracked in the left lens. He was bleeding from a deep cut above his eyebrow. He was also completely ignoring his own injuries. He was levitating a stretcher. Fast. Hermione's chest seized. She knew the shape of the man on that stretcher before she saw his face. She knew the exact line of those shoulders. She knew the specific, rigid way he held himself, even when unconscious. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Unmoving. Draco Malfoy. Put him down, Hermione snapped. Her voice didn't shake. It was a miracle. It was a lie. Harry dropped the stretcher onto bed 4 with a heavy thud. Malfoy's head rolled to the side. His eyes were closed. His skin was the color of old parchment, completely drained of the faint, aristocratic flush he usually carried. There was blood. So much of it. It soaked through his dark tactical vest, staining the white collar of his shirt a violent, saturated crimson. What hit him? Hermione demanded. She didn't wait for an answer. She drew her wand. A sharp, diagonal slash through the air. The tactical vest split open. Another slash. The white shirt tore away, exposing his chest. She saw the mark. It wasn't a standard dark magic burn. It wasn't a curse scar. It was a black, jagged spiderweb of necrosis. It spread outward from his sternum, digging into his skin like poisoned roots. It pulsed. Not in time with his heartbeat. It had its own, terrible rhythm. Hermione knew that rhythm. She had read the emergency memos from the Department of Mysteries. A compounding curse. Hermione's stomach dropped. The floor vanished beneath her feet. Hermione. Harry said. His voice cracked. He leaned heavily against the frame of the bed. He took it for a junior Auror. Pushed the kid out of the way before the suspect fired. Quiet. She raised her wand. The diagnostic charms flowed out of her in a rapid-fire sequence. Blue. Silver. Yellow. The glowing colors hovered over his chest, twisting together. They read his magical core. They tracked his blood flow. They mapped the nerve damage. The numbers were bad. The colors were worse. The bright yellow turned to a sickly, rotting green before her eyes. The compounding curse. It didn't just injure. It multiplied. A broken rib became a shattered ribcage in an hour. A punctured lung became complete respiratory failure in 2. It fared on the victim's own magical core to accelerate the damage. Straight! Hermione barked. The junior healer jumped, nearly dropping a tray of bandages. I need blood replenishing potion. 6 vials. I need essence of dittany. I need a localized stasis field anchored to his sternum, right now. Strout hesitated. Her eyes darted to the black, pulsing web on Malfoy's chest. Healer Granger, standard protocol for the new compounding cases. I don't care about standard protocol, Hermione said. Her voice dropped. It was completely flat. It was terrifying. Bring me the potions or get out of my ward. Strout ran. Hermione turned back to Malfoy. He was so still. He was never still. Even when he was standing at the edge of a crime scene, pretending to be bored, his hands were always moving. Adjusting a cufflink. Tapping a long finger against his thigh. Spinning his wand. Now, nothing. Hold on, Malfoy. She muttered. She pressed her bare fingers against the side of his neck. The dragonhide glove was gone. She didn't remember taking it off. His skin was freezing. His pulse was a faint, thready flutter against her fingertips. It was there. He was there. Healer Granger, a voice said from the doorway. Head Healer Robards. Hermione didn't look up. She took the vials from a breathless Strout. She popped the cork on the first one with her thumb and started pouring the thick red liquid down Malfoy's throat. She massaged his throat to force the swallowing reflex. Healer Granger, this is the compounding curse, Robards said. He walked into the ward. He sounded tired. Defeated. We've lost 3 Aurors to this in the last month. The protocol is strict palliative care. Hermione stopped. She put the empty vial down. She looked up. Excuse me? You can't fix it. It multiplies faster than our healing magic can repair the tissue. Every spell you cast just gives it more magic to feed on. Make him comfortable. The ward went dead silent. Harry took a step forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of his wand. Hermione beat him to it. Get out, she said. Robards blinked. Granger, I said get out. She stood up. She wasn't tall, but right now, she took up the entire room. Magic crackled in the air around her, making the loose strands of her hair float. This is my ward. This is my patient. I am not making him comfortable. I am making him live. Now leave. Robards looked at her. He looked at the black web spreading across Malfoy's chest. He shook his head slowly. 72 hours, Granger. Robards said quietly. That's how long the others lasted. You are wasting your time. He turned and walked out. Hermione exhaled. A sharp, shaking breath. She turned back to the bed. The compounding curse had a 72-hour clock. Once it hit the 72nd hour, the necrosis reached the heart muscle. Total system failure. Irreversible. She glanced at the large clock on the wall above the double doors. Midnight. 72 hours. Malfoy groaned. Hermione's head snapped back to him. A muscle flexed in his cheek. The muscles in his neck strained. His eyes opened. They were silver. Cloudy with pain, unfocused, but silver. He blinked against the harsh lighting of the ward. His gaze dragged across the ceiling, down the monitors, and finally landed on her. Granger. He rasped. His voice sounded like dry gravel. Don't speak, she said immediately. She grabbed her wand, casting another layer of stasis over his chest. You've been hit by a compounding curse. I am freezing the spread temporarily, but it hurts. I know it hurts. Malfoy let out a short, breathy sound. It might have been a laugh. It sounded like agony. Always, so bossy, he managed. He squeezed his eyes shut as a tremor wrecked his body. I'm fine. Stop looking so panicked. I'm not panicked. I am a professional, she lied smoothly. Her hands were shaking as she uncorked a pain relief draft. You're terrible at lying. He was fighting the pain, fighting to keep it off his face. It was the most infuriating thing about him. He would bleed out before admitting he needed help. Drink this, she ordered, pressing the vial to his lips. He didn't argue. He drank it. He coughed, a wet, awful sound, and fell back against the pillows. Bedside manner needs work, he whispered. If you die on my table, Malfoy, I will revive you just to kill you myself. Shut up and let the potion work. A tiny, pained smirk touched the corner of his mouth. Then his eyes rolled back, and he fell into a heavy, magically induced sleep. Hermione stood over him, breathing hard. She grabbed a piece of parchment and a self-inking quill from the cart. She started writing furiously. Counter curses. Arithmetic formulas. Potion ingredients. Experimental tissue regeneration theory. Her mind was a steel trap, snapping shut on every piece of obscure magical knowledge she had ever consumed. Hermione. Harry was still there. He was leaning heavily against the wall near the door, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked pale. Sit down, Harry, she said, not looking up from her parchment. Strite will look at your shoulder. And your head. I'm fine. You're bleeding on my floor. Sit down before you pass out. Hermione. Harry's voice was softer now. Heavy. She finally stopped writing. She looked at him. He wouldn't let anyone else touch him, Harry said. He looked at the unconscious Malfoy, then back at her. His green eyes were entirely too knowing. The medics on site tried to load him onto a standard transport to St. Oswald's. He fought them off. He was coughing up blood, he couldn't stand, and he fought them. Hermione swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight. He said, "Bring him to you," Harry finished. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "He's an idiot," Hermione whispered. "He trusts you. He's an idiot." She repeated. She looked back at the parchment. The letters were blurring. Harry gave a small, exhausted smile. He knew. He had always known, even when she tried to hide it behind clinical detachment and workplace arguments. "Fix him, Hermione," Harry said simply. "I'm going to." Harry nodded. He pushed off the wall and let Healer Strout guide him toward a bed on the opposite side of the ward, safely out of the blast radius of Hermione's focus. The ward slowly emptied out. The other junior healers gave bed for a wide berth. They knew better than to interfere when Hermione Granger was working on a puzzle she refused to lose. They checked the other patients. They dimmed the main lights. They left her alone. She was alone with him. Hermione dropped her wand onto the metal side table. It clattered loudly. The frantic, professional energy drained out of her in one long, devastating rush. Her shoulders slumped. Her knees felt weak. The clinical shield shattered, leaving nothing but the raw, terrified woman underneath. She looked at him. Draco Malfoy. The sharp, aristocratic lines of his face were softened by the heavy sleep. The perpetual sneer was completely gone. He just looked young. Young and horribly pale. She reached out. Her hand trembled. Just a little. She brushed a lock of pale blonde hair off his forehead. It was damp with cold sweat. Her fingers lingered against his skin, feeling the fever burning just beneath the surface. She mapped the line of his cheekbone with her thumb. "You stupid, stubborn man," she murmured. The silence swallowed her words. His chest hitched. A ragged, painful breath slipped past his lips. The black web on his chest pulsed, glowing faintly in the dim light. Hermione pressed her thumb hard against the side of her wand, feeling the wood bite into her skin. She pulled her hand back from his face. She reached down and grabbed his wrist instead. She pressed 2 fingers firmly against his pulse point. Beat. 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 Steady. Stubborn. Just like him. She dragged a hard wooden chair to the bedside and sank into it, her grip on his wrist completely unyielding. If she let go, he might slip away. Not today. Not ever. She glanced up at the large clock on the wall. 12:15 a.m. 71 hours and 45 minutes left. 72 hours, she whispered to the empty room, her thumb pressing against his pulse. "I'm going to fix this, Malfoy. I promise." She looked at the black mark on his chest. It was a death sentence. For anyone else, it was an undeniable, unavoidable death sentence. But Draco Malfoy was not anyone else. And Hermione Granger was not going to let him die. She pulled her giant stack of reference books closer with a flick of her wand. She opened the first one, a heavy tome bound in dragon leather. She didn't let go of his wrist. The clock ticked. The long night began. Draco Malfoy woke up exactly the way he preferred not to. Slowly, painfully, and completely at the mercy of someone else. The first thing he registered was the smell. Sterile. Sharp. Blood-replenishing potion and antiseptic charms. It was a very specific, aggressive cleanliness that belonged entirely to St. Mungo's. The second thing he registered was the pain. It was a living thing. It sat heavy and hot in the center of his chest. It didn't burn cleanly like dark magic usually did, searing and fading. This was different. It felt like glass shattering inside his ribcage with every single breath he took, the shards grinding against his lungs. He didn't move. He didn't open his eyes. He focused all his remaining willpower on keeping his breathing perfectly even. Shallow. Measured. In through his nose, out through his mouth. Show nothing. Give them nothing. It was a survival instinct drilled into him since childhood. Then, he felt it. A cool, steady wash of magic rolling over his skin. It pushed back against the fire in his chest, wrapping around the pain like a heavy blanket. It smelled like old parchment, rosemary, and ozone. Hermione. He forced his heavy eyelids open. The ward was too bright. He blinked against the harsh morning sunlight streaming through the tall, enchanted windows. He tried to turn his head. It felt like moving through wet cement. His neck muscles screamed in protest. She was there. She was always there when things went horribly, irreversibly wrong. Hermione Granger was standing right beside his bed. She had a glowing diagnostic crystal in her left hand and her vinewood wand in her right. She was muttering furiously under her breath. Complete degradation of the cellular wall, but the stasis charm is holding the necrosis to the upper sternum, she was whispering rapidly to herself. Her hair was an absolute disaster. It was piled high on top of her head, held together by sheer willpower and a spare quill. Strands were escaping in every direction. She looked terrible. She looked beautiful. Draco swallowed. His throat felt like sandpaper dragging against broken glass. "Are you quite finished poking at me, Healer Granger?" he managed to say. His voice was a weak, thready rasp. He hated how weak it sounded. He hated that she was hearing it. Hermione jumped. She nearly dropped the glowing diagnostic crystal on the floor. She whipped around to face him. Her brown eyes were wide. She looked completely exhausted. There were deep, bruised shadows under her eyes, stark against her pale skin. Her healer robes were wrinkled. She definitely hadn't slept a wink. "You're awake," she breathed. Astute observation. Draco forced a trademark smirk onto his face. It pulled painfully at the stiff muscles in his jaw. "Top of your class for a reason, Granger." She didn't rise to the bait. That was the first sign that things were truly bad. Usually, she would snap back immediately, armed with a cutting insult about his aristocratic laziness. Instead, she just leaned over him. She pressed the back of her bare hand against his forehead. Her skin was cool. It felt incredibly good against his burning skin. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, just to stop himself from leaning into her touch. "Your fever is still dangerously high," she said. Her voice was strictly professional. Clinical. It was a shield she wore when she was in the ward, especially when she didn't want him to see how panicked she actually was. Pain level? Tolerable. "Malfoy, do not lie to me." She pulled her hand back, crossing her arms over her chest. "The curse is compounding in your sternum. The diagnostic charms indicate severe, aggressive nerve damage. It feels like you are being repeatedly stabbed with a rusty knife. Give me a number between 1 and 10. Draco opened his eyes. He looked up at her stern, uncompromising face. 4. He lied again. It was a solid 8. It was actively climbing toward a 9. Hermione ground her teeth. "You are the worst patient I have ever had the misfortune of treating in this hospital," she said flatly. She turned her back on him, reaching for a silver tray of potions beside the bed. "And your bedside manner is frankly appalling." Draco shot back. He tried to shift his weight to prove he was fine. He braced his elbow against the mattress and tried to push himself up into a sitting position. Fire tore through his chest. It felt like his ribs were physically unknitting themselves. He gasped, falling back against the pillows hard. Hermione spun around immediately. She dropped her wand on the tray and planted both her hands firmly on his shoulders, pinning him to the mattress. "Stop moving," she ordered. Her voice cracked. Draco looked up at her. He was breathing hard, fighting the wave of nausea that the sudden pain had triggered. "Is this how you treat all your dying patients, Granger?" he choked out. "Manhandling them?" Hermione went completely still. Her hands were still pressing him down into the bed. Only the ones who were too stubborn to die quietly, Malfoy. She said softly. She slowly released his shoulders. She picked up a small vial of thick, bubbling purple liquid from the tray. She turned back to him. Her eyes were hard, but her hands were entirely gentle. "Drink," she ordered. Draco looked at the purple liquid suspiciously. It bubbled slightly against the glass. It smelled strongly of sulfur and fermented algae. "What is that?" "Pain relief and localized tissue regeneration," she said, holding it closer to his mouth. "Drink it." "I don't need Draco." "Drink the potion." She only used his first name when she was scared. He didn't argue anymore. He opened his mouth. She tipped the vial, letting the thick, viscous liquid slide down his throat. It tasted infinitely worse than it smelled. It was like swallowing liquid ash. Disgusting, he coughed. "You're welcome," she replied smoothly. She set the empty vial down on the tray. She picked up a damp white cloth from a metal basin of water on the bedside table. She started wiping the cold sweat from his neck and collarbone. Her touch was light, precise, careful. He hated how much he needed it. He hated that he was here, looking pathetic. He hated that he had landed in her ward, completely broken, forcing her to drop everything to put him back together. She worked too hard already. She saved too many people. She didn't need him adding to her endless burden. "You should go home," he said, trying to sound casual. Hermione stopped wiping his neck. She looked down at him, her brow furrowing. "Excuse me?" "You look terrible, Granger. Go home. Sleep. I am your primary healer. I'm not going anywhere. I have a compounding curse," he said bluntly. He had seen what it did to the other Aurors. He knew the strict timeline. It multiplies. It feeds on magic. The palliative care team should be handling this. Not you. Go home. "I don't care what the palliative care team does," she snapped. She threw the damp cloth back into the basin with a loud splash. "You are not dying on my watch. I'm fixing this." "Granger, no." She leaned closer to him. She braced her hands on the mattress on either side of his shoulders, boxing him in completely. Her face was inches from his. He could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "You do not get to dictate my treatment plan. You do not get to push me away just because you're scared. I'm not scared." He lied for the third time. He was terrified. Not of dying. He was a Malfoy. He had made peace with death years ago. He was terrified of the look on her face right now. A sheer, desperate, unyielding determination. If she failed to save him, it would break her. He could not let him be the thing that broke her. "If you move that arm one more time to push me away, I will magically bind you to this mattress, and don't think I won't," she warned. Her voice shook, just a little. Draco looked at her. Really looked at her. She was terrified too. He swallowed the sarcastic retort he had ready on his tongue. He let his head fall back against the pillow in defeat. The purple potion was finally starting to work its way through his system. The sharpest, most jagged edges of the pain were dulling into a heavy, manageable ache. "Fine," he muttered. Bossy swat. Stubborn idiot, she replied instantly. But she didn't move away. She stayed right where she was, leaning over him, her hands braced beside his head. He could smell her shampoo. Vanilla and something floral. It was maddening. She reached out and carefully adjusted the collar of the hideous hospital gown they had forced him into. Her knuckles brushed against his collarbone. Draco closed his eyes, fighting a shiver. "How long do I have?" he asked quietly. The silence stretched. He heard the rustle of her heavy healer robes as she finally stood up straight. 64 hours. She said. Her voice was clipped again. Professional. 64 hours. Less than 3 days. Right, Draco said. He kept his eyes closed. You'd better get to work, then, Healer Granger. I'm already working. He heard the scrape of a wooden chair against the stone floor. He opened one eye. Hermione was sitting beside his bed again. She had a massive stack of reference books on the small rolling table next to her. She pulled the top one onto her lap and opened it with a thud. She grabbed a self-inking quill. She was practically vibrating with nervous, brilliant energy. Her brow was furrowed in deep concentration. Her lips moved slightly as she read the ancient text. It was his favorite look on her. Draco watched her in silence. The pain in his chest was a dull roar, constantly threatening to spike, but the steady, rhythmic thrum of her magic acting on the Stasis field kept it securely at bay. He was damaged goods. He was an Auror with a literal death sentence. He had spent the last 3 years actively keeping his distance from her, admiring her from afar, trading cheap insults in the ministry cafeteria just to hear her say his name in that exasperated tone. He had thought he was protecting her from him. From his name, from his past, from his mess. Now, he was literally dying in her ward. He shifted his left arm, wincing as the slight movement pulled at his chest muscles. He reached across the small gap between the edge of the bed and her chair. He caught the edge of her lime green sleeve between his index finger and thumb. Hermione stopped writing immediately. She looked down at his hand, gripping the edge of her sleeve. Then she looked up at his face, her expression unreadable. "What do you need?" she asked. She was instantly alert, slipping back into healer mode. "Are you in pain? Does the Stasis field need adjusting?" "No," he said softly. He just didn't want her to move away. He just wanted to hold onto her for a second. He let go of her sleeve and let his hand drop onto the edge of the mattress, inches from her leg. "Just checking if you were paying attention," he deflected weakly, looking away toward the window. Hermione looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She saw right through his pathetic deflection. She always did. She didn't say anything. She just reached out and covered his pale, cold hand with hers. Her hand was warm now. It felt perfect. "I'm paying attention," she said quietly. Draco didn't pull away. He couldn't find the strength to push her away anymore. He closed his eyes, letting the heavy exhaustion of the potions drag him under the surface. He watched her in his mind as he drifted off. She was frantically scribbling notes on his chart, fighting a ticking clock that she categorically refused to lose. He closed his eyes completely, letting her magic wash over him, knowing he was exactly where he wanted to be. Part 3. The fever breaks the second night was always the hardest in the curse damage ward. Hermione Granger knew this. It was a well-documented medical fact. The second night was when the initial adrenaline wore off. It was when the exhaustion finally breached the blood-brain barrier. It was when the quiet of the hospital stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling like a tomb. She looked at the massive clock on the wall. 3 a.m. 31 hours left. The numbers blurred together. She blinked hard, rubbing the heels of her hands into her tired eyes. The bruising purple shadows under her eyes had darkened to a deep, sickly grey. She hadn't slept since he arrived. She hadn't left the ward. She hadn't eaten anything except half a stale biscuit Strout had practically forced down her throat. She couldn't stop. If she stopped, the black web on his chest would win. She looked back down at the heavy, leather-bound text on her lap. It was a restricted volume from the Department of Mysteries library. She was currently breaking at least for ministry regulations just by having it open. She didn't care. Her quill scratched furiously across a long roll of parchment. She was calculating the volatile reaction between crushed asphodel root and powdered unicorn horn when introduced to a compounding necrotic curse. It was a theoretical cure. It was highly dangerous. She crossed out a long string of arithmetic runes. The equation didn't balance. If she administered the potion with that specific ratio, the unicorn horn would violently accelerate the necrosis instead of killing it. Damn it. She whispered. She snapped the quill in half. Ink splattered across the parchment, ruining 3 hours of meticulous calculations. She threw the broken pieces of the quill onto the floor. She buried her face in her hands. The frantic, professional energy drained out of her in one long, devastating rush. Her shoulders slumped. Her knees felt weak. The clinical shield shattered, leaving nothing but the raw, terrified woman underneath. A sharp, ragged gasp echoed through the quiet ward. Hermione's head snapped up. Draco was thrashing on the bed. The heavy blankets were tangled around his legs. His hands were gripping the metal bed rails so tightly his knuckles were completely white. His jaw was locked. He was fighting for air. Hermione kicked her chair back. It crashed to the floor. She ignored it. She lunged for the bedside table, grabbing her wand. "Malfoy," she said sharply. He didn't hear her. His eyes were squeezed shut. His head thrashed from side to side against the damp pillow. She ripped the blankets away from him. The stasis field hovering over his chest was flickering. It was supposed to be a solid, glowing blue. Instead, it was flashing wildly, sparking like a dying electrical wire. The black web of necrosis was fighting back. It was aggressively eating through the magical barrier she had built. The jagged black lines were visibly inching higher toward his collarbone, creeping closer to his heart. "No, you don't." She snarled at the curse. She pointed her wand directly at his sternum. She didn't use a standard incantation. This required raw, unfiltered magical force. She pushed every ounce of her own magical core down her arm and through the vinewood. A blinding blue light erupted from the tip of her wand. It hit the cracking stasis field. The magical backlash hit her like a physical blow. It knocked the breath out of her lungs. It felt like she had stuck her hand into a blazing fire. She didn't let go. She grit her teeth and pushed harder. "Stay back," she commanded the curse. The blue light flared violently, completely illuminating the dark ward. Then, with a sharp, high-pitched crack, the stasis field snapped back into place. It solidified, trapping the black necrosis underneath it once again. Hermione collapsed against the side of the bed. She was gasping for air. Her one arm was shaking uncontrollably. Draco went completely limp. The violent thrashing stopped. "Malfoy?" She breathed. She reached out with a trembling hand and pressed her fingers to the side of his neck. His skin was burning. The fever was completely out of control. It was radiating off him in waves. His skin was slick with a heavy, unhealthy sweat. "Straight!" Hermione yelled toward the closed double doors. "I need ice. Now!" Bypassing the junior healer entirely, she cast a rapid sequence of cooling charms over the air above his bed. It wasn't enough. The fever was deeply magical, a byproduct of his core fighting the curse. Snatching a clean white towel from the cart, she plunged it into an ice-charmed basin and wrung it out. She pressed the freezing cloth to his burning forehead. Draco flinched violently at the contact. "Sure," she murmured instinctively. "I know. It's cold. I have to break the fever." He groaned. It was a terrible, desperate sound. He opened his eyes. They were completely blown wide. The silver irises were entirely swallowed by the dilated black pupils. He was completely delirious. The fever had burned away all of his carefully constructed defenses. "Granger." He slurred. His voice was thick and heavy. "I'm here," she said. She folded the cold towel and moved it down to the side of his neck, pressing it directly against his racing pulse. His breath hitched. He turned his head into the touch, chasing the cold. The movement brought his face incredibly close to hers. She could feel the erratic, burning heat of his breath against her cheek. She went perfectly still. "Always, bossing me around." He mumbled. His eyes were unfocused, looking somewhere past her shoulder. "Someone has tour," she said quietly. Her voice was shaking. She dipped a second towel into the ice water. She unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of his hospital gown. She tried to ignore the sharp, sudden spike in her own heart rate. She pressed the cold cloth to his collarbone, carefully avoiding the glowing blue star's field over his sternum. Draco sighed. It was a long, heavy exhale. His left hand shot out. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong for a man who was actively dying. His burning fingers wrapped completely around the delicate bones of her wrist. Hermione stopped wiping his collarbone. She looked at his hand. "Draco, let go," she said. It was a gentle command, but she didn't try to pull away. "No," he said stubbornly. His head rolled on the pillow until he was looking directly at her. The delirium was still there, clouding his eyes, but there was a terrifying, raw honesty underneath it. "You work too late," he slurred. Hermione blinked. "What?" "In your office," he said. He dragged his thumb across the inside of her wrist. The touch sent a violent shock of electricity straight up her arm. "3rd floor. You leave the lamp on. It's the only one on." Hermione inhaled sharply. Her office in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures was on the 3rd floor. She often worked past midnight. But he worked on the 2nd floor, in the Auror headquarters. "You watch my window?" she asked. The words slipped out before she could stop them. "Always," he whispered. His eyes fluttered shut. His thumb stroked her wrist again. Slowly. Intentionally. You look so tired, Granger. Always so tired. I wanted to bring you tea. But you'd just yell at me. I wouldn't yell at you, she lied softly. She probably would have. You would, he argued weakly. You always yell at me. I like it. Hermione stuttered him. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs. The clinical shield wasn't just shattered. It was entirely gone. This was the fever talking. It was the delirium. He didn't know what he was saying. But it felt like a confession. It felt like the heavy, unspoken thing that had been lingering in the air between them for 3 years was finally being dragged out into the harsh light of the hospital ward. She didn't know what to do with it. She was entirely unequipped to handle it. She leaned closer. She couldn't help it. She was drawn to him like a magnet. Draco. She breathed. He opened his eyes again. The silver was a little clearer this time. The ice-cold towels were finally dragging his core temperature down, breaking the fever. His gaze dropped from her incredibly close face to his own hand, taking in his desperate, possessive grip on her wrist. He blinked. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The heavy fog of the delirium vanished, replaced instantly by stark, horrified clarity. He remembered what he just said. He dropped her wrist like it had burned him. Hermione stumbled back a step, startled by the sudden, violent rejection. Draco dragged himself backward against the pillows, putting as much physical distance between them as the small hospital bed would allow. His face went completely blank. The aristocratic mask slammed back into place with terrifying speed. "Get away from me," he said. His voice wasn't slurred anymore. It was sharp. It was cruel. Hermione stopped moving. Her hand hovered in the air where he had just dropped it. "Malfoy, your fever." "I said get away from me, Granger," he snapped. He refused to look at her eyes. He glared at the wall over her head. "Stop touching me." The rejection stung. It felt exactly like a physical slap across the face. Hermione lowered her hand. She stood up straight, suddenly acutely aware of how wrinkled her robes were, how disastrous her hair looked, how completely pathetic she must seem. "I was trying to bring your temperature down," she said. Her voice was ice cold. It was a defense mechanism. She built her own walls right back up to match his. "I don't need your pity." He spat. The pain in his chest flared, and he winced, but he didn't stop talking. He was pushing her away deliberately. He was burning the bridge before she could cross it. "I don't need you hovering over me like some bleeding heart martyr. I am your healer, I am a dead man." He interrupted harshly. He finally looked at her. His eyes were completely devoid of the warmth they had held 2 minutes ago. "I am a dead man, Granger. The clock is ticking. You know it. I know it. So stop pretending you can fix me and go home." "I am not pretending," she said, her voice rising dangerously. "Yes, you are." He yelled. The effort made him cough violently. He hacked, clutching his chest, but he kept glaring at her. "You are wasting your brilliance on a lost cause. On a Death Eater. On someone who isn't worth saving." The silence that followed was deafening. The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. It was the lowest blow he could have possibly thrown. He was using his own past, his own deep-seated self-hatred, as a weapon to force her away. He wanted her to agree. He wanted her to give up and leave, so he wouldn't have to watch her fail. He wanted to spare her the pain of his death by making her hate him right now. Hermione understood exactly what he was doing. She examined him for a long, heavy moment without yelling or crying. Quietly, she collected the broken pieces of her quill from the floor and tossed them into the waste bin. She righted her fallen chair with a loud, defiant thud and sat back down. "You are an absolute coward, Draco Malfoy," she said quietly. Draco flinched. The words hit harder than any hex she could have thrown. "You think pushing me away is going to work?" She continued. Her voice was entirely flat. It was the voice she used when a suspect tried to lie to her in an interrogation room. "You think acting like a cruel, self-pitying bastard is going to make me pack up my books and go home?" He didn't answer. He glared at the ceiling, his teeth gritted so hard the muscle twitched. "I don't care if you push me away," she said. She pulled the restricted text back onto her lap. She grabbed a spare quill from her pocket. "I don't care if you insult me. I don't care if you yell." She dipped the quill in the spilled ink on the table. "I am going to find the cure to this curse," she said, her voice dropping into a deadly, unyielding promise. "I'm going to fix your chest. And when you are fully healed, I'm going to punch you square in the jaw for being such a massive idiot." Draco closed his eyes. A small, ragged breath escaped his lips. "You're wasting your time, Granger," he whispered. But he didn't tell her to leave again. Hermione ignored him. She bent her head back over the arithmetic formulas. She started completely over, calculating the exact decay rate of the necrosis. She could feel him watching her from the bed. She could feel the heavy, unresolved tension suffocating the small space between them. The temperature had spiked. The boundaries had been completely obliterated and then violently rebuilt. They were both bruised. They were both terrified. She looked up at the massive clock on the wall. 4:15 a.m. 29 hours and 45 minutes left. The clock ticked. Hermione gripped her quill and kept writing. Draco Malfoy was drowning. That was exactly what it felt like. He was lying flat on his back in a perfectly sterile hospital bed, entirely dry, but he was slowly, agonizingly drowning in his own body. The compounding curse had finally reached his lungs overnight. Every single breath he took was a shallow, ragged gasp that burned like inhaled acid. The sharp, shattering glass sensation from yesterday was completely gone. Now, it was just a heavy, crushing weight pressing down relentlessly on his chest, squeezing the air out of him molecule by molecule. It was methodical. It was terrifyingly efficient. He didn't bother trying to open his eyes, needing every single ounce of his dwindling strength just to keep his lungs expanding. Lying perfectly still, he listened to the horrifying wet rattle deep in his own chest. He was dying. He knew it with absolute, crystalline certainty. The sharp, panicked edges of his fear had dulled into a heavy, suffocating resignation, leaving him to focus intensely on the sounds around him. The ward was no longer quiet. It wasn't the hushed, professional silence of a hospital. It was filled with a frantic, aggressive, bubbling hiss. He forced his heavy eyelids open. It felt like lifting lead weights. The harsh morning sunlight was filtering through the tall enchanted windows, casting long, pale shadows across the cold stone floor. It was morning. The third day. 12 hours left. He turned his head slightly on the damp pillow. The friction of the cotton against his cheek felt like sandpaper. Hermione Granger had completely lost her mind. She had somehow moved a massive, heavy brass cauldron directly into the center of the curse damage ward. It was suspended over a crackling blue magical fire that threw frantic, dancing shadows against the walls. Standing at the stainless steel prep counter beside the boiling potion, she completely ignored the thick, violet sparks that landed dangerously close to her shoes. She looked entirely unhinged. Her crisp healer robes were gone, abandoned on the floor somewhere in the dark corner of the room. She was just wearing her standard ministry blouse and dark, sensible trousers. The sleeves were rolled up haphazardly past her elbows. Her hair was completely loose now, a wild, tangled halo of brown curls framing a face that was terrifyingly pale and drawn. She was chopping something on a scarred wooden board. The knife hit the wood with a frantic, punishing, staccato rhythm. Chop! 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 She was moving far too fast. Her hands were shaking violently. Draco watched her. He couldn't look away if he tried. He was utterly captivated by the sheer, desperate force of her will. She was actively trying to bend the immutable laws of magic and nature just to keep him breathing for another day. The heavy silver knife slipped. Hermione gasped loudly, dropping the blade onto the steel counter with a sharp, ringing clatter. Draco's heart spiked, sending a fresh, agonizing wave of pain tearing through his chest. "Granger," he rasped. His voice was completely gone. It was barely a breath of sound. She didn't hear him, her attention fixed entirely on her left hand. A bright, thin line of brilliant crimson blood was welling up rapidly across her palm, slipping over the edge and dripping down her pale wrist. Without reaching for a bandage or casting a basic healing charm, she simply wiped her bleeding hand roughly across her dark trousers, picked the heavy knife back up with a bloody grip, and kept chopping. Draco's breath hitched in his throat. The emotional dam inside him, the heavy, impenetrable stone wall he had meticulously built around himself for 3 years to keep her out, cracked right down the middle and shattered. He couldn't watch this anymore. He absolutely could not watch her destroy herself trying to fix something that was already broken beyond repair. "Hermione," he said. He forced her name out of his throat, pushing past the agonizing fire in his failing lungs. It was louder this time. It was the first time he had used her given name since they were teenagers screaming at each other in drawing rooms and castle corridors. The knife stopped instantly. Hermione stopped abruptly at the counter. Her shoulders went completely rigid under the thin fabric of her blouse. She turned around very slowly. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. The bruising under her eyes was entirely black. Her hands were covered in shimmering silver powder, crushed roots, and her own bright blood. "You're awake," she breathed. Her voice was raspy. "Broken." "Stop," Draco said. He struggled to push himself up on his elbows. The blue stasis field over his chest flickered dangerously as he moved. The black web of necrosis was clearly visible underneath it, branching up his pale collarbone, creeping up the side of his neck like dark, poisonous ivy. "Don't move," Hermione ordered instantly, dropping the knife again. She practically sprinted across the ward, closing the wide distance between the counter and his bed in 3 frantic, stumbling steps. She reached blindly for her vinewood wand. "Stop," Draco repeated. He let go of his formidable pride. He let go of his endless stubbornness. He let go of absolutely everything. He reached out with his left hand and grabbed her wrist firmly before she could raise her wand to cast another spell. Her skin was freezing cold. He could feel the fine, exhausting tremor running through her entire arm. "Malfoy, let go," she said frantically, trying to pull away. "Your breathing is too shallow. The necrosis has officially reached the lower respiratory tract. I need to recast the localized stasis and add a supplemental oxygen charm before the damage becomes irreversible. Stop working." He interrupted. His voice broke completely. Hermione looked down at him. Her wide brown eyes were absolutely terrified. "I can't stop," she whispered. Her voice was trembling violently now. "I am entirely out of time. The standard countercurses aren't penetrating the core magic of the spell. I am brewing a highly unstable localized tissue regeneration draft. If I don't finish it perfectly in the next 2 hours, the reaction will completely fail. Hermione." He squeezed her cold wrist. "It's over." "No," she shouted. The sudden volume of her voice shocked them both. It echoed loudly off the high stone ceiling of the empty ward. "No," she repeated, her voice dropping back down to a desperate, shaking whisper. "I am not accepting that. I am your healer. I'm fixing this. You're bleeding," he pointed out softly. He dragged his thumb slowly over the smeared blood on her palm. He didn't care about the ministry regulations anymore. He didn't care about their complicated, incredibly messy history. He just hated seeing her bleed. Hermione looked down at her hand, as if she was noticing the deep cut for the very first time. A single tear spilled over her lower lashes. It carved a clean, wet track down her pale, exhausted cheek. Draco's chest ached terribly, and for the first time in 3 days, it had absolutely nothing to do with the dark magic eating his heart. "You look terrible, Granger," he murmured affectionately. "Shut up," she cried softly. More tears followed the first, falling silently onto the collar of her ruined blouse. "You are not dying today. I am not letting you die today." "I don't think you get a vote," he said gently. He tugged on her wrist. He didn't have much physical strength left, but she didn't resist him. She let him pull her closer to the side of the metal bed. "Granger, please," he said. The protective sarcasm was entirely gone. His voice was completely raw and honest. "Just stop. For a minute." Hermione looked at the bubbling brass cauldron across the room. She looked at the bloody knife abandoned on the counter. She looked at the giant clock ticking mercilessly on the wall. Then she looked down at him. "I can't," she choked out. "Just for a minute," Draco pleaded. He didn't care how pathetic he sounded. He was terrified, and he was in blinding agony, and he didn't want to do this alone anymore. "Please. Just sit with me." The frantic, professional energy drained out of her in one long, devastating rush. Her shoulders slumped. Her knees felt weak. The clinical shield shattered, leaving nothing but the roar, terrified woman underneath. Letting out a harsh, broken sob, she bypassed the wooden chair entirely. She kicked off her heavy ministry-issue shoes and climbed directly onto the narrow hospital mattress beside him. Draco gasped quietly as the mattress dipped heavily under her weight. Moving incredibly carefully, she curled herself into the small, empty space on his left side, ensuring she didn't touch the glowing blue stasis field or the spreading black web on his chest. She wrapped her arms tightly around his waist and buried her face in the curve of his neck, right below where the black necrosis permanently stopped. Shaking uncontrollably, she cried against his skin, her tears hot and wet on his collarbone. Draco closed his eyes. He wrapped his right arm around her shoulders, pulling her tight against his side. The sudden movement sent a blinding flash of white-hot agony through his ribs, but he didn't care. He buried his face deep in her wild, tangled hair. She smelled like vanilla, ozone, and copper blood. It was the best thing he had ever felt in his entire life. The world shrank rapidly until it was just the two of them, huddled together on a narrow bed in the center of a sterile hospital ward. The bubbling cauldron and the ticking clock faded entirely into the background. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "Don't," she sobbed quietly against his neck. She tightened her desperate grip on his waist. "Don't apologize. Don't say goodbye. I expressly forbid it." He smiled weakly against her soft curls. Even now, facing the end of the world, she was unbearably bossy. He rubbed his hands slowly up and down her back, feeling the hard tension knotted tight in her spine. He desperately wanted to take it away. He wanted to give her the peace she had been tirelessly trying to give him for the last 3 days. "I've got you," she whispered against his skin. Her voice was fierce, even through the heavy tears. "I'm right here. I'm right here. I know," he murmured. Holding her tighter, he felt the sharp pain in his chest and the heavy, crushing weight still suffocating him, but the blinding terror was completely gone. He wasn't drowning anymore. He was exactly where he was always supposed to be. Anchored entirely by the warm weight of her in his arms and the desperate, stubborn promise echoing in her voice, he closed his eyes and let himself drift. If this was the absolute end, he decided quietly, it wasn't a terrible way to go. The heavy brass cauldron shrieked. It was a high, violently piercing whistle that cut straight through the heavy, suffocating silence of the curse-damaged ward. The crackling blue magical fire burning underneath it suddenly flared a brilliant, blinding white, sending dancing shadows spinning wildly against the stone walls. Hermione's head snapped up abruptly from the mattress. She had been lying perfectly still for the last hour, wrapped tightly around Draco's side, listening with mounting dread to the agonizingly slow, wet rattle of his failing breathing. She had been looking blankly at the wall, her mind exhausted, almost convincing herself that this was exactly how it was going to end. She had almost accepted the terrifying quiet. The heavy cauldron whistled again, louder this time. Thick, heavy silver sparks began spitting aggressively from the boiling surface, launching into the air and hitting the stone floor tiles with sharp, incredibly loud popping sounds that echoed like tiny firecrackers. The potion was ready. Hermione scrambled off the narrow hospital bed instantly. Her legs were completely numb from lying perfectly still for so long. She stumbled hard, catching herself heavily against the edge of the stainless steel prep counter. She completely ignored the sharp, radiating spike of pain in her hip. She ignored the bone-deep exhaustion dragging at her limbs. She ignored the dried blood still flaking across the back of her left hand. Adrenaline hit her bloodstream like a massive, physical blow. She looked up sharply at the massive clock on the wall. 52 minutes left. She spun around and looked directly at Draco. He hadn't moved. He hadn't even flinched at the piercing, shrieking whistle of the boiling cauldron. He was completely unconscious. The black web of necrosis had crept ominously out from under the flickering blue edges of the failing stasis field. It was no longer securely confined to his chest. The dark, jagged, Venomous lines were tracing aggressively up the pale, vulnerable column of his throat. They were actively reaching for his jawline, crawling upward inch by terrifying inch. "Hold on," she breathed, a cold, sharp spike of panic suddenly seizing her throat. "Just hold on a little longer." She snatched a pair of thick, protective dragonhide gloves from the rolling medical cart. She shoved them clumsily onto her shaking hands and grabbed the incredibly heavy iron handle of the cauldron. Grunting with the sheer effort, she hauled it entirely off the magical fire and slammed it down onto the steel prep counter. The liquid inside wasn't a liquid anymore. It had transformed into a thick, glowing, violently silver sludge that bubbled menacingly. It smelled powerfully of ozone, crushed asphodel root, and the sharp tang of raw lightning. It was highly unstable. It was completely untested on human subjects. It was the absolutely only option they had left. Hermione grabbed her vinewood wand and cast a rapid, complex sequence of diagnostic charms directly over the glowing sludge. The diagnostic numbers flashed bright gold in the air above the counter. The arithmetic balance was perfect. The tissue regeneration properties were registering completely off the charts. But there was a massive, terrifying problem. The magical density of the potion was entirely too high. If she tried to simply pour it directly onto the curse, the necrotic magic would violently and instantly repel it. The resulting clash of opposing magics would cause a massive localized explosion right over his heart, killing him instantly. The potion couldn't just be applied topically. It had to be forcefully, magically pushed directly through the skin barrier. It required a direct, unbroken, skin-to-skin magical transfer to safely merge with his failing core. It required a living conduit to push the cure inside. It required her. Hermione didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. She didn't waste a single heartbeat, weighing the extreme personal risk to her own magical core. Ripping the heavy dragonhide gloves off her hands, she threw them violently onto the floor. She grabbed the collar of her ruined, tear-stained ministry blouse and pulled it roughly over her head, tossing it entirely aside. Left standing in just her plain, thin white undershirt, she pushed the short sleeves all the way up to her shoulders, leaving her arms completely bare to the cold air of the ward. Without hesitating, she grabbed a wide, shallow ceramic bowl from the shelf above the counter. Tipping the heavy brass cauldron very carefully, she poured the glowing silver sludge into the bowl until it was almost overflowing. The intense heat radiating off the potion felt exactly like standing directly next to an open, roaring furnace. Carrying the glowing, scalding bowl carefully, she hurried over to the side of the bed. "Draco," she said sharply, trying to rouse him. He didn't answer. His chest barely rose. His breathing was so shallow it almost completely failed to register. Hermione kicked off her shoes and climbed directly onto the narrow metal bed. There wasn't nearly enough room to kneel beside him effectively. She had to straddle his hips, bracketing his waist tightly with her knees to properly anchor herself for the massive magical push. She looked down at his ruined chest. The localized stasis field was barely holding together. It was flashing a frantic, desperate, warning red, actively buckling under the immense, crushing pressure of the rapidly multiplying curse. She had to drop the protective shield entirely. She had to expose the raw, unfiltered dark magic to the open air in order to apply the cure directly to the source. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling violently in the quiet room. "I am so sorry, Draco." She raised her wand steadily. Finite incantatum, she commanded clearly, pouring her will into the simple spell. The protective blue shield shattered instantly, dissolving like broken glass raining down around them. The horrifying smell hit her instantly. It was the rancid, deeply suffocating stench of rotting magic and ancient, decaying earth. The black web on his chest flared aggressively to life. Without the heavy stasis field holding it securely back, it began visibly expanding, eating through the healthy pale skin around his ribs at a terrifying, accelerated speed. Draco's body arched violently off the mattress as the pain hit him. His eyes flew open. They were completely blank, wide with blinding, unadulterated agony. He opened his mouth wide, but he didn't have enough air left in his failing lungs to actually scream. Hermione moved instantly, ignoring the terrifying sight. She plunged both of her entirely bare hands directly into the ceramic bowl. The glowing silver sludge burned her skin like liquid fire. She bit down on her bottom lip so hard she immediately tasted sharp copper blood, absolutely refusing to scream. She coated her palms completely in the glowing, incredibly unstable magic. She pulled her dripping hands out of the bowl. She slammed them completely flat against Draco's bare chest, directly over his failing heart. The magical reaction was brutally explosive. A blinding, concussive shockwave of raw magic blasted violently outward from a point of contact, blowing the heavy privacy curtains entirely backward and instantly shattering the glass in the tall enchanted windows across the room. Draco screamed. It was a horrible, tearing, visceral sound that violently ripped through the quiet ward. His hands flew upward instinctively, grabbing blindly at Hermione's wrists. His grip was entirely desperate, bruising her fragile skin instantly. "Push!" Hermione screamed aggressively at herself. She leaned all of her weight heavily over him, locking her elbows rigidly straight. She pushed her own magical core fiercely down her arms, using her entire body as a living, breathing conduit to forcefully shove the thick silver potion directly through his skin. The bright silver magic hit the black necrosis exactly like a sledgehammer. The dark magic fought back violently, refusing to die quietly. Thick, oily black tendrils erupted aggressively from his chest. They wrapped fiercely and tightly around Hermione's glowing silver fingers, actively trying to crush her hands. The curse was magically intelligent. It knew it was dying. It was desperately trying to find a fresh, healthy new host to survive. The aggressive black tendrils slithered rapidly up her wrists, wrapping tightly around her forearms exactly like dark, freezing snakes. The cold was absolute and terrifying. It felt exactly like being plunged completely into a frozen, icy lake. The dark magic started aggressively eating directly into her skin, leaving burning, jagged black lines tracing rapidly up her arms toward her elbows. Draco's clouded vision cleared for a frantic fraction of a second. He looked up. He clearly saw Hermione straddling him, bathed completely in blinding silver light, her face heavily twisted in pure, unadulterated agony. He saw the terrifying black curse actively crawling up her bare arms, violently invading her own magical core. A sharp spike of panic, completely separate from the overwhelming physical pain, seized him entirely. "No!" He choked out desperately. He didn't grab her wrists to hold on this time. He grabbed her arms to forcefully shove her off him. He pushed her backward with every single ounce of terrifying, desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength he had left in his dying body. "Let go!" He roared hoarsely. "No!" Hermione screamed back, her voice echoing loudly over the magical rushing sound. She locked her knees much tighter around his hips. She absolutely refused to move. She shoved her glowing, burning silver hands significantly harder against his sternum, actively fighting his desperate push. "It's taking you," he yelled, his voice breaking violently into a ragged, bloody cough. He shoved her arms again, trying desperately to break her physical connection to the dark curse. "Granger, let go of me right now. Shut up and live," she screamed back at him. She closed her eyes tightly. She stopped holding anything back. She tapped entirely into the absolute bottom of her own magical core. She pulled every single remaining drop of raw, unfiltered power she possessed and forcefully shoved it down her arms. The silver sludge trapped on her hands flared significantly brighter than the midday sun. The overwhelming, blinding surge of pure healing magic blasted aggressively through the black tendrils currently wrapped around her arms. The dark magic shrieked loudly, a horrible, high-pitched, metallic sound that echoed painfully in the small room. The invading black lines on her arms turned instantly to fine, harmless ash. The heavy silver magic poured directly and cleanly into Draco's chest. It raced aggressively along the expansive black web of necrosis, hunting down every single dark, jagged line hiding under his skin. Draco arched upward violently one final time, a breathless, entirely choked gasp escaping his pale lips. Then, with a deafening, incredibly concussive crack, the curse shattered entirely. The massive black web covering his chest completely dissolved into a massive cloud of fine grey ash. The ash hung thickly in the air for a single, quiet second before the surging ambient magic of the room completely blew it away into nothingness. The blinding, burning silver light vanished entirely. The sudden, heavy silence in the ruined ward was absolute, completely broken only by the sound of harsh, desperate breathing. Draco collapsed heavily backward onto the damp pillow. His eyes were closed. His chest was heaving violently, pulling in massive, ragged, incredibly clear lungfuls of air. There was absolutely no horrifying wet rattle. The terrible, crushing weight was completely gone from his lungs. His skin was perfectly, beautifully pale. There was absolutely no trace of the black web left anywhere on his chest or his neck. Hermione's locked elbows finally gave out completely. Collapsing entirely forward, her exhausted face hit his bare, rapidly healing shoulder. She couldn't move an inch or speak a single word. Completely drained, every muscle in her entire body was shaking uncontrollably. Her arms were covered in angry, stinging red burns exactly where the dark curse had grabbed her, and her palms felt like they had been held directly over an open flame, but she absolutely didn't care. She was alive. He was alive. Draco didn't open his eyes. He didn't try to speak. Weakly lifting his heavy right arm, he wrapped it securely around her waist, pulling her entirely collapsed weight flush against his side. He buried his face deeply into her wild, tangled hair again. Taking a deep, clear, absolutely perfect breath, he held her. Draco Malfoy woke up very slowly. It was a strange sensation. For the last 3 days, waking up had been a violent, terrifying event. It had involved frantic gasping, blinding flashes of white-hot agony, and the absolutely horrifying realization that he was drowning on dry land. This morning was completely different. He opened his eyes. The ceiling of the curse damage ward was painted a very dull, unremarkable white. He looked at it for a long moment, waiting for the familiar, crushing weight to press down on his lungs. It didn't happen. He took a slow, experimental breath. The air flowed easily down his throat, filling his chest completely. There was absolutely no rattle. There was no sharp, shattering glass sensation. There was only a dull, aching soreness across his ribs, the the kind of mild discomfort that came from being hit by a standard bludgeoning hex, not a fatal necrotic curse. He was alive. The realization hit him like a warm wave. He turned his head slowly on the pillow. The heavy privacy curtains were drawn entirely back. Bright, cheerful morning sunlight was streaming cleanly through the tall windows. The enchanted glass that had violently shattered outward during the magical explosion was completely repaired, looking perfectly untouched. Then he felt the weight resting heavily on his left side. He looked down. Hermione Granger was fast asleep. She was curled tightly against his side, entirely occupying the small, narrow space between his hip and the edge of the metal bed. Her right arm was thrown heavily across his stomach. Her face was buried deeply in the crook of his neck, her soft breath ghosting rhythmically over his collarbone. She was still wearing just her thin white undershirt. Draco lay perfectly still, completely terrified that moving even a fraction of an inch would wake her up and ruin the moment. He took his time studying her. The bruising purple shadows under her eyes were still dark, a stark proof of the punishing 72-hour marathon she had just run to save his life. Her brown curls were a wild, chaotic mess, tangled in a massive halo around her pale face. He gently lifted his right hand. He brushed a stray curl away from her forehead. The movement pulled his attention downward. Both of her bare arms were wrapped securely in thick, pristine white medical gauze, covering the skin from her wrists all the way up to her elbows. Draco's chest tightened painfully. He remembered exactly what had happened. The frantic shouting. The blinding silver light. The horrifying black tendrils wrapping violently around her arms as the curse tried desperately to consume her magical core instead of his. He remembered screaming at her to let go, shoving her backward to save her life. She had absolutely refused. Someone, likely Strout, or another junior healer who had rushed into the ward after the explosive magical shockwave, must have treated her burns and bandaged her arms after she had finally collapsed against him. He ran his thumb very lightly over the edge of the white gauze on her right wrist. Hermione stirred. Her brow furrowed slightly. She let out a soft, exhausted sigh, turning her face deeper into the warm curve of his neck. Draco smiled. It was a genuine, quiet smile, something he hadn't worn in years. "Granger," he murmured softly. She didn't wake up immediately. The exhaustion was too deep. Her body had completely shut down the second the adrenaline had finally left her bloodstream. He shifted slightly, wrapping his left arm securely around her waist to keep her from falling off the narrow edge of the mattress. "Hermione." He tried again, his voice a little louder, dropping into the low, rough register of sleep. She gasped sharply. Her brown eyes flew open. Panic, sharp and instantaneous, entirely flooded her face. She pushed herself up violently, her hands slamming flat onto his chest. "Draco!" She gasped, her eyes darting frantically to his face, then down to his sternum. "You're breathing the curse, I'm fine," he said instantly. He reached up and grabbed her wrists gently, stopping her frantic visual inspection. "I'm perfectly fine, Granger," he repeated, his voice remarkably steady. "The curse is completely gone. I can breathe." Hermione stared down at him. She was hovering directly over him, her hair falling like a heavy curtain around them, boxing them into their own private world. She blinked slowly. The sharp panic in her eyes slowly dissolved, replaced entirely by overwhelming, bone-deep relief. "You're alive," she breathed. "I am," he agreed quietly. "Thanks to you." The absolute silence of the ward settled heavily around them. The adrenaline crash hit Hermione suddenly, forcefully stripping away the last remaining traces of her professional healer shield. The terrifying reality of the morning after finally caught up with her. She suddenly realized exactly where she was. She was straddling his hip, practically lying on top of him in a sterile hospital bed. She was wearing absolutely nothing but a thin white undershirt and her dark trousers. Her bare legs were tangled completely with his under the thin cotton blanket. A bright, furious blush exploded across her pale cheeks, coloring her skin a deep, vibrant red. "Oh, Merlin!" She choked out. She tried to scramble backward instantly, desperate to put a polite, professional distance between them. Draco didn't let her go. He tightened his grip on her wrists very slightly, just enough to stop her frantic retreat without hurting her burns. He didn't want the polite distance. He was completely done hiding behind heavy stone walls and arrogant sarcasm. "Don't," he said softly. Hermione went rigid. She looked down at him, her chest heaving slightly under the thin white shirt. "Malfoy, I shouldn't need to get up." She stammered awkwardly. "Strite will be coming in for the morning round soon. The head healer is going to demand a full incident report. I broke at least 14 ministry regulations yesterday. I don't care," Draco said simply. He slowly released her wrists. He slid his hands up her arms, resting his palms gently over the thick white gauze wrapping her forearms. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low whisper. Hermione swallowed hard. She looked at his hands touching her bandages. "No," she lied quietly. Strout applied a burn healing paste. "It just aches." "You shouldn't have done it," Draco said. The memory of the black tendrils crawling up her arms sent a cold shiver of terror straight down his spine. "You could have died. The curse was actively trying to consume your magical core, Hermione. I told you to let go. And I told you to shut up and live," she replied instantly. A familiar, bossy spark finally flared back to life in her brown eyes. "You were being an absolute idiot. I was trying to save your life. By sacrificing your own," she countered hotly, her voice rising in the quiet ward. "Which was completely unacceptable. You don't get to make those decisions for me, Draco Malfoy. I was the patient." He argued smoothly, a faint, familiar smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "I have rights. You lost all of your patient privileges the absolute second you tried to physically shove your healer off a hospital bed during a delicate magical procedure." She fired back without missing a single beat. Draco laughed. It was a completely genuine, rough sound that surprised them both. It didn't hurt his chest at all. Hermione studied him. The furious blush faded slowly, replaced by a soft, incredibly fond expression that made his heart skip a dangerous beat. The argument died instantly, leaving behind a heavy, emotionally charged silence. Hermione shifted slightly on the bed. She didn't try to pull away this time. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his face carefully. "You said things," she said quietly. Draco stopped smiling. The heavy reality of his feverish delirium crashed back down on him. He remembered the ice-cold towels, grabbing her wrist, and telling her exactly how closely he watched her window on the 3rd floor of the ministry. Lying would be so easy. Blaming it entirely on the fever and rebuilding the heavy stone wall right now would spare him the terrifying vulnerability of rejection. but looking at the white bandages completely covering her arms, remembering how she had literally walked through fire to save his life, he made a firm decision. He wasn't going to lie to her ever again. "I did," he admitted evenly, holding her gaze without flinching. Hermione took a very slow, careful breath. "Were they true?" she asked. Her voice was incredibly fragile. Or was it just the fever talking? "The fever stripped away the filter, Granger," Draco said softly. He moved his right hand, slowly tracing the elegant line of her jaw with his thumb. "But it didn't invent the facts. Every single word I said was entirely true." Hermione's breath hitched audibly in the quiet room. "You watch my window," she whispered. "Every single night," he confirmed quietly. "I know exactly how you take your tea. I know that you snap your quills in half when a calculation frustrates you. I know that you work entirely too hard because you're terrified of failing." He watched her eyes widen slightly at the stunning accuracy of his observations. "I also know," he continued, his voice dropping into a rough, intimate register, "that I have been completely in love with you for 3 years, and I was entirely too much of a coward to say it until I thought I was dying." The confession hung heavily in the air between them. Hermione gazed at him. A fresh wave of tears rapidly welled up in her brown eyes, making them shine brilliantly in the morning sunlight. "You really are an absolute idiot," she whispered softly. "I've been told," he agreed with a small, self-deprecating smile. She leaned down very slowly. She rested her forehead gently against his, closing her eyes. The physical proximity was overwhelming. He could feel the rapid, frantic beating of her heart pressing directly against his own healed chest. "I was so terrified," she confessed, her voice breaking on the last word. "When the stasis field cracked, I thought I was going to lose you." "You didn't," he promised fiercely. He wrapped both of his arms securely around her waist, anchoring her tightly to him. "You didn't lose me, Hermione. I'm right here." She let out a long, shaky breath, her breath washing warmly over his lips. "You promised to punch me firmly in the jaw when I was fully healed." Draco reminded her quietly, the familiar banter sliding effortlessly back into place. Hermione opened her eyes. She was so close he could clearly see the tiny flecks of gold hidden in her brown irises. "I did promise that," she agreed softly. "I am currently fully healed," he pointed out, arching a pale blonde eyebrow in a silent challenge. A small, genuine smile finally broke across her exhausted face. It was completely beautiful. "I'm too tired," she whispered, her gaze dropping slowly to his mouth. "Remind me tomorrow." "I will," he promised. Without waiting another second, he lifted his head slightly off the damp pillow, closing the tiny remaining distance between them. He kissed her. It wasn't a frantic, desperate collision of teeth and adrenaline. It was incredibly soft. It was warm, exhausted, and perfectly deliberate. Hermione melted against him instantly. She tangled her bandaged fingers gently in the soft blonde hair at the nape of his neck, returning the kiss with a desperate, lingering sweetness that completely knocked the breath out of his newly healed lungs. He kissed her until the lingering fear of the last 3 days was entirely erased, replaced completely by the solid, undeniable reality of her mouth against his. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. Hermione rested her cheek gently on his chest, right over his beating heart. She draped her bandaged arm comfortably across his stomach again, settling her entire weight fully onto him without hesitation. "Go to sleep, Granger." Draco murmured, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her messy curls. "Don't boss me around," she mumbled sleepily against his collarbone. Draco smiled into the quiet room. He wrapped his arms tightly around her, resting his chin on the top of her head. He watched the cheerful morning sunlight slowly trace across the white stone floor of the ward. He closed his eyes, perfectly anchored by the warm weight of her in his arms, and finally went to sleep.